Greetings, everyone, wherever you are. My name is Malik AbdouMaliq Simone. I'm an urbanist. I largely work geographically for most of my life in different African cities and cities in South and Southeast Asia. What I wanted, I have to say at the beginning that that you have to bear with me a little bit because it is way past midnight where I am. And so it may be a little, I may be a little incoherent at moments, but I'll try to make sense most of the time. What I want to do is in these sessions is to take a project that we've been developing in a relationship between the Urban Institute at the University of Sheffield and the Beyond Inhabitation Lab at the Polytechnic University in Turin on Black urbanism, and to use some of these notions from Black urbanism as a way to think through where the city is going, and some as a particular angle on new angles on urban life, and by Black urbanism, what I mean is the ways in which the realities of urban habitation by different Black populations across the world, what those kinds of realities and practices, what kinds of knowledge, what kinds of orientations, what kinds of practices emerge from those kinds of experiences, and how they might be folded into an analytic that might be applicable to think through the ways in which different kinds of urban situations reach toward each other, what they have to offer each other across different geographies, so that it's not in some sense an urbanism that is specific to the particular needs or struggles or experiences of Black populations, but rather how those kinds of experiences that emerge contribute to an analytic that rethinks across different kinds of urban geographies. So I wanted today to just simply show some slides to introduce some of these concepts, some of these notions on extensions. So the notion of extensions is our way of trying to crystallize what those kinds of contributions of Black urbanism constitute. That is a kind of extensionality as a mode of urban existence and operation, and to think through what that might be. And then next time to talk more specifically about Blackness and about Blackness in its relationship to urbanization. And then finally, in the third session, to look at some kinds of interventions, some kinds of actual engagements that try to put these concepts to work in some way. So I want to perhaps then just start with going through some of these concepts, some of these points, and then turn to you and to ask you, to talk about the kinds of things that are of concern to you, what your interests, and so that we can think about more specifically addressing what those are in the subsequent sessions. So I will start. So I want to start with the notion of the city as something that is in some ways broken. That is, conventionally, the city has been seen as a kind of consolidation, as a culmination of particular densities and intersections of various kinds of capacities, of particular kinds of structural processes. So I want to, in some ways, start with the reversal, the inverse of that, and think about the city as broken. Broken compacts, broken solidarities, broken connections, broken interdependencies. And thus the importance of then the notion of extensions. And not just in the sense of extended urbanization, which is a notion that is perhaps familiar through the work of Lefebvre, in terms of the way in which urbanization processes extend and reproduce themselves through their own self-perpetuating logic. And to think about extensions not as a kind of fractal replication of format or formula, but extensions as kinds of entanglements, as interminglings, as a way in which different modalities of existence wrap themselves around each other, speak to each other, affect each other. So entanglements of different locations, of different ways of living, different games of getting by, different logics and identities of what any given place might be. And in the literature that I suggested to accompany these discussions, these are certainly the sort of emphases on entanglements, on intermingling, and entanglements and intermingling, not to repair the brokenness, but brokenness as a kind of default condition that suggests its own possible dispositions. That is, rather than seeing brokenness as a kind of problem to be fixed, or as the coming to an end of, or the dysfunctionality of particular relationships. While brokenness may indeed be all of those things, what is it that brokenness itself suggests? What kinds of futures, what kinds of possibilities does the sense of brokenness entail? Just like the famous pictures of plants that emerge from a broken pavement. So in some sense, that extensions is not so much of a place, but a process of extending across various lines of zones, functions, locations, identities, and temporalities. And so these extensions also take place at the level of the body. Bodies that find the effort to stabilize through consolidating place, acquiring assets, maximizing consumption, offer an increasingly limited horizon. Too much labor, too much indebtedness, too much compliance. Who distribute social life and livelihood across multiple locations and opportunities. That is, if in some ways a lot of the biopolitics of the city, a lot of the orientation of policy and livelihood has focused on how do people become settled, how do they consolidate their life in place, how do they stake a claim, how do they carve out a relationship between themselves and place so that that place begins to represent something about who they are, and that place then takes on the characteristics of those that come to settle there. That this kind of consolidation, this kind of inscription in place, in terms of contemporary urban life, and particularly urban life in much of the global South, is being shifted to one of an emphasis on circulation, on movement, about how one distributes oneself, how one distributes one's relationships, one's extended family, one's limited assets, one's time, one's orientation, how this is distributed across multiple locations and opportunities, so that the body itself becomes a kind of vehicle of extending, of extensions. The body extends itself across different kinds of social relationships, across different kinds of locations, across different kinds of games. And this in some ways places the notion of itineraries over the ones of emplacement. So in some ways, to find out who someone is and to think about what it is that they are incapable of is less a matter of identifying them with a particular kind of place than it is identifying them across their kinds of itineraries of everyday movement. This doesn't mean that everyone is in some sense free and capable of moving wherever they want. It doesn't mean that people are not in some ways stuck in particular kinds of emplacements. I mean, in one of the neighborhoods I grew up as a kid in Englewood in the south side of Chicago, I know today that many kids don't really leave don't really go beyond a kind of 6 square block area. That in some ways there are multiple kinds of confinement, that the carceral, that the notion of being captive and imprisoned isn't just a matter of the prison, but often a matter of being relegated to particular kinds of places where one can feel in some ways operative. So it's not to deny or to mitigate in some sense the importance of such emplacement, either volitional or not volitional, but rather simply to point to a kind of shift underway, a shift of emphasis and orientation. And thus the urban becomes, in some sense, a kind of constant recalibration of movement, and itself constantly recalibrated by movement. Even when people are held in place, and particularly in particular built environments adamantly hold on. So there's something about the complexion of places within urban context where there's a kind where in some areas there's a kind of obdurate holding on of things that seem to never go away, and there are other places where things change so often, really change very, very often. So in some ways, endurance, the ability to keep going, is less a function of cemented ties, of a particular kind of relationship to people, to place, but a continuous repositioning of a place, whether it's a factory, a tea stall, a restaurant, a house, to a shifting realignment of broken details. So in some ways, that this raises the question is what kind of a frame? What kind of a frame is able to hold together all of the different kinds of elements of urban life? There are certainly forms of calculation, forms of governance, increasingly algorithmically centered, that try to cement and to assess particular relationships between all kinds of heterogeneous and disparate aspects of urban life. The relationship between local finance and transportation patterns and household livelihoods. And so that in some ways there are these sort of modes of calculation which attempt to constitute a kind of frame which attempts to hold all of these heterogeneities together in some kind of proportionality, some kind of sense of mutual causation. But at the same time, those kinds of frames, that kind of overarching sense of coherence, is something that is also put into increasing question, as the kind of overall sense of how people are connected to each other begins to often dissipate. As we well know, I mean, in terms of urban life, what is it that holds people together? What is it that becomes a kind of viable locus of connection when consumption, accumulation, everyday living becomes increasingly individuated and individualistic? So extensions are, in one sense, include a sense of intense artificiality. It's not the model of organic communities. It's not the resolution of conflicting tenure regimes and practices and agendas, but rather, when we talk about extensions, it's the simultaneous existence of these differences of technical artifacts rather than social representations per se, like the artifice of hair extensions. When someone puts extensions in their hair, it is a kind of technical artifice to, in some sense, redesign the image of the body, but yet it's sometimes looking as if it is something that is natural. And so in some ways, the way in which extensions are oftentimes ones of prothesis, the add-ons, the kinds of technical capacities which increase the ability of human life and human cognition to do things. Extensions are also infrastructural, the way in which particular kinds of, of, of delivery, of providing services, providing capacity happens through the extensions of existing kinds of grids. Extensions also are a kind of technicity of different kinds of games that people play in order to draw attention to themselves, games to make claims, games to obtain attention, games to make themselves known, games that people engage in order to be noticed, to enable themselves to be recognized, to be taken seriously, games that enable people to be folded in, invited in to other people's agendas, to have a kind of position, to have a kind of opportunity. All of these in some ways are a process of extensionality. And so in some ways, if one considers the city as a consolidation of propertied land, of property, of populations with individuated properties that are demonstrated through citizenship, of densified spatial functionalities, economic aggrandizement, and the maximization of value-added activity. If all of these are sort of the common characteristics of city life, of the kind of relations of property, of citizenship, of spatial density, of spatial definition, of function, of the way in which different kinds of economic activities are interconnected, the way in which land, the value of land is maximized by, for example, building vertically, building huge condos, huge mega developments. If all of these kinds of things have in some ways defined the city, the way in which these things are extended is not so much in their fractal replication. It's not just so much repeating them as the city expands out into its hinterlands. It is partly that, but it's also in some ways the way in which the way in which these factors begin to consolidate the city are themselves abrupted, the way in which they are changed, the way in which they are modified, the way in which they are subject to a certain upheaval, as the very way in which the urban begins to extend itself. So in some ways, expansion isn't simply, and growth isn't simply the repetition of things. It's not simply a kind of the expansionist of the same kind of logic, but rather that these extensions take place in some ways through beginning to be able to rearrange these kinds of processes in different ways. And I'll get to that in a little bit. And all of this is then coupled with, you know, what Vero Gago is fond of saying in terms of generalized plunder, always a kind of theft of orientation through the seemingly extensions of extended debt. For example, where I am at the moment, there's a very concerted attempt to break up many different kinds of popular working poor, working class neighborhoods that were based on the way in which people had each other. What they had was they had each other. They had the possibility of negotiating everyday life with each other. They had the possibility of sharing resources, of engaging in complementary different kinds of activities, certain kinds of solidarity. And the way in which the state begins to try to break up those kinds of territories through, in some ways, plundering their lives in a way, a kind of theft of their capacities by luring them into new residential situations of so-called affordable housing, where, for example, no money down, 20 different kinds of payment plans, but yet people are then in some ways enrolled in a process of always paying off the debt. They will never stop paying. And so this is a kind of theft of orientation, that in some ways people's capacities to negotiate particular dispositions of the city, that those capacities are in some sense plundered in terms of enrolling them in a process of endless indebtedness. So in some ways, the terrain on which justice is to be done, and there's always this sense of what is the just city, what is a sense of urban justice, would seem to entail removing any impediments that foreclosed longevity to the oppressed and condemned them to a slow death. So there are always, in some sense, struggles in some ways to provide people with better livelihoods, better opportunities for self-determination, for a way in which they can participate in the design and the governance of their own territories of life. And to a large extent, this is exactly what justice is. But I'm interested in the question that Fred Moten raises, is not so much whether justice is done through such an orientation, but rather the extent to which our ideas of justice, how applicable are they to the ways in which the eruption of normative trajectories, the way in which the tumultuous spilling of life in wayward, inexplicable ways is both the product of subjugation and of life's priority. And that is sometimes impossible to navigate this distinction. In other words, what the question that Moten is posing here is, what is it about, in some sense, urban life, which is increasingly subjected to calculation, increasingly subjected to the maximization of value, not just the value of land, but the value of individual lives, the way in which the kinds of ideas and practices and socialities of even the most marginal of urban residents can be used as a way to service what would be considered lives worth living, which normatively are considered ones that are always in the process of being developed. A life always under development, always trying to achieve new kinds of capacities, new kinds of skills, new education, new kinds of consumptions, new kinds of abilities. The way in which the that so many dimensions of urban life become increasingly a product of intensive calculation. And that in response to this, that somehow to not be captive to this is always to find ways in which to, that through, that the way in which urban residents now attempt to extend themselves beyond a certain kind of making themselves visible, extending themselves beyond simply the declaration, this is who I am, this is where I belong, these are my aspirations, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to become, and to make that known in very definitive ways. That increasingly also the urban becomes an arena where people try to dispense with those kinds of representations, those kinds of declarations, those kinds of orientations, and find ways of, in some sense, being all over the place, of using the kind of processes of urbanization as a kind of platform of invention and experimentation, even if it's within very limited sense of working with the few materials you have and doing something completely unprecedented and different with it. Just to give you an example, one of the neighborhoods that I work in Jakarta is renowned for people propositioning each other. And propositioning each other not in terms of a sexual proposition, but on the street in everyday life, always seeming to be making outrageous suggestions about where one can find, if you go to the corner and if you bring a bottle of water to the woman sitting there and you read these few lines to her, she might be able to tell you where you can get a 50% discount on a bag of rice. And then you go there and then you're passed along to another market, or always residents in some ways making sort of outrageous propositions about certain kinds of possibilities. One saw this in some ways in the pandemic period. For example, friends of mine described in Mumbai at a time where people were looking for canisters of oxygen, that it didn't matter who you were, it didn't matter what position you had, it didn't matter who your networks were, it didn't matter how much money you had. Everyone was scrambling for those canisters, and your particular kind of position within a particular hierarchy didn't give you any particular advantage. It was this sort of wild exchange of messages on what's up group, and all of a sudden people would discover 50 canisters in the back of a stall in a market selling cloth, and people would rush there and they would be gone, and they would get a message about other places where you might find them. And so in some ways, this is what I mean by the kind of tumultuous spilling out of life in wayward, inexplicable ways. And in some ways, what Fred Moten is trying to say is that this is both a product of subjugation and of life's priority, and that it's sometimes difficult to navigate what that distinction is. So this intricate weave of seeming contradictions and effective intensities of giving out is posited then as an underlining of what I call the urban extensions. Now, on the one hand, these extensions represent something that is always in upheaval and unsettling, a foregrounding of an excess of artifice, something unnatural and disruptive of whatever appears organic, where consensus is foreclosed and whatever coordination ensues is premised more on strange alliances, the coming together of things that seemingly don't belong. On the other hand, extensions entail acts of compassion, a lending of hands that do not incur debt, that don't require precise recognition of those to whom a hand is lent, nor the instantiation of the morality, law, or agendas of the lender, where nothing is owed or anticipated in a space that can be both liminal or nothing whatsoever. So both notions of extensions, that which is a kind of process of unsettling, of strange alliances that never seem to be institutionalized, never seem to be settled, and extensions as a kind of extending oneself, a kind of act of compassion. Both of these are at work in the feral landscapes of many, many neighborhoods, particularly across the urban South, in the dense intermixture of a decline in ascendancy, commerce, and residence, and the shatterscot contiguities of seemingly everything in the hinterlands of urban regions. So in some ways, extensions are not just a kind of location. It's not a particular geography of the city, but rather it is the coming together of this sense of both unsettling and of giving out, of giving out without the requirement of debt, that show up in different ways across different aspects of urban life. So these extensions, they upend the ontological dispositions of the city. That is, they throw into question the city's always conceit to crystallize human potency to arrange natures, the city's claim to embody the will of free individuals. Extensions are speculative futurisms in that they constitute alternative readings of what might take place within a specific order of things. So the city has always been, or the predominant readings of the city have always been preoccupied with settlement. Even while there's been a lot of focus in urban studies on mobility, so as to counter the dominance of this preoccupation, I think there remains a kind of underappreciation of the way in which movement takes place. Now, people have always moved. And instead of seeing movement simply as a descriptor of transport and conveyance, or the activity entailed in shifting bodies from one location to another, human movement is consonant with the fact that all matter constantly moves. And here the work of Karen Barad is maybe perhaps particularly cogent. So whatever stabilization indeed emerges is not the cessation of movement, but rather the capacity of things to move with and through each other. The ways in which the conventional holds, institutions, sites are extended into a series of middle spaces which do not belong to anywhere specific, but yet can act specifically to gather up different sentiments and ways of doing things in experimental ways. So in some sense, this notion of being unsettled comes. I don't want to make this kind of unsettling process something that is overly romantic. I mean, it is difficult to be unsettled. It is difficult to not have some kind of anchorage. And we know in some ways the way in which a lot of the urban economy operates these days is through very precarious labor, the platform labor, where things are always being unsettled, where the drivers, the deliverers, the are always in some sense uh, in a process of a process of being unsettled, and increasingly the way in which precarity describes short-term employment without contract, or the need to always be involved in continuous training in order to keep up, the way in which the distinctions between work and non-work are always blurred. So precarity is a kind of omnipresent reality of much of contemporary labor and contemporary residence. But also unsettling operates as a kind of urban architecture that pushes residents into new arrangements of living and income generation, with a kind of presumption that things won't last for very long. And so in many instances, its institutions are not being built, but rather they're always in some sense temporary arrangements whose experimental nature is driven more by the inability to assume a normal life than a progressive imagination. And so, in some sense, this unsettling is an ability to jump scale, to bring together innovative connections amongst media, materials, cultural norms, and physical settings. And money is less the creation of a new collective sensibility than a kind of series of tactical improvisations in the midst of sociality falling apart, being dissolved into an expanding archive of details strewn across vast distances and not really distant given the reach of social media. So the sense of extensions that I'm trying to grapple with here is the real difficulty of unsettling, the real precarity involved in the kind of unsettling of the way in which people have attempted to anchor themselves, to belong, to consolidate some kind of viable life for themselves. But unsettling also is a kind of generative process, a way in which everything is sort of tossed in the air. And what happens within those kinds of moments of suspension, ways in which things can witness and reach and open themselves up, and to pay attention and interact with each other in unprecedented ways that won't find a kind of deep institutional form. They might not last for very long, but yet they do create a kind of new sensibility, a new sense of being in the city. And so the notion of extensions is in some ways in which those two different notions of unsettlement attempt to, in some ways, reach toward each other. What are the kinds of connections entailed in this? It's in some ways the similar notion with dispossession. We know that in some ways people are in cities are frequently dispossessed of their land, dispossessed of their social intimacies, dispossessed of viable employment, dispossessed of jobs that they had for long periods of time. And so dispossession oftentimes then raises the question of what does repossession mean? And oftentimes repossession carries with it still this sense of property, to repossess, to rehold on, to re-anchor, to reestablish. And not that that's not important. It is important. But in some ways, the capacity to move on of invention, of trying to figure out new ways of doing things, itself requires a dispossession. To be dispossessed of that which is familiar, to be dispossessed of the kinds of belongings, the kinds of elements through which you identify yourself, how you are productively dispossessed of these things. So one is situated in the midst of this kind of tension, of this kind of ambiguity. So the urban extensions, in some sense, are characterized by an incessant, an ongoing rearrangement of spatial products, their form, their functions, and their valuations. And that in rearrangements that in the process of taking form then would seem to at least confound the existing capacities to make things count in one way or the other. Again, during the pandemic period, I was coordinating a kind of a monthly discussion of colleagues that were urban researchers in 35 cities across the South. And what everyone was saying about their experiences of working with the communities and institutions, which was their work during the pandemic, was the way in which things were being rearranged. The notion of the household, that in some sense the pandemic became a kind of window to the extent to which it was very clear the way in which households in many cities have nothing to do with who lives in a particular home. That the household is not something that was, in some sense, defined by kin, defined by, mother, father, children, aunts, grandfather. But the household was something much more malleable, much more extensive, much more a process of how things were continuously rearranged, how a sense of mutual responsibility and intimacy took place not between a defined set of characters, but was always being in some ways circulated, rearranged amongst a shifting set of actors, both in terms of who were proximate and those that weren't. And that under lockdown, when states ordered that people were to remain in the house, that households were to remain within the household, that so many people didn't have the sense of being with the household when they were in the house, that somehow there was a kind of cut, and those that they were living with were somehow that kind of arrangement was in some sense inexplicable to them in some ways. They also talked about all the ways in which schools became dormitories, the way in which markets became important kinds of fora of political decision making. So this sense of rearrangement, that those things that we associate with a particular kind of identity and function, we're able to always shift, or the way in which those kinds of institutions and locations were revealed to not be what we might have thought that they were. So rearrangements in the process of taking form seem to at least confound the existent capacities to make things count in one way or another. Now, relations are inevitable. Nothing is one thing, and the only thing that's one thing is nothing. So things are always to be added and subtracted and multiplied, as everything is more or less something else. But is this oscillating, sliding rearrangement necessarily tied to specific values, especially as the continuous running of algorithmic relations eventually exceed anything that can be defined? So how to detach from the hold of weighted numbers? That is, again, this sense that this sense of the kind of weight and the domination of evaluation, of assigning particular kind of value to things. And Denise Ferreira da Silva talks about the notion of differences without separability, differences that are simply differences, differences that can't be apportioned in any particular schema of the more or less valuable or the more or less relatable, where there is no other that constitutes the ground for a delimited view of worthiness or eligibility. So in some sense, this is that this notion of rearranging is in this sense of differences without separability. Or what has oftentimes been called inoperable relations. Guys are like eruptions, even whose specific location and force of discharge can never be known in advance. Of inclinations, of long histories of experiments, conjunctions, mutual projects, sometimes amongst unwitting participants, that seem to intentionally avoid assuming the form where they would be subject to political contestation or empirical verification. Relations proposed that are detached from obvious genealogy, that compress things conventionally viewed as impossible to be together, and that have no way of knowing whether they will endure or not. In other words, the technical dimensions of the relationalities of urbanization come from all over the place and work in different degrees, proportions, and manifestations that come to be associated with it, but that also don't intrinsically belong to it. That is, relations of which it's very difficult to provide a kind of empirical evidence in some ways that are able to trace the way in which they affect each other. But if you think of the way, if you take a particular neighborhood and you think of all that takes place right now, the arguments in the kitchen, the kind of kids playing on the street next door, the way in which someone is on the phone with someone, hundreds of miles away, the way in which there is a kind of meeting taking place, or a prayer group across the street, or people eating in a restaurant down the block. These are all simultaneities. And one might think, okay, the only discernible, the only recognizable relationships amongst all these things is that they happen to take place within the same kind of geographical area. That's the only way that we can tie them together. But in what ways do they affect each other? What ways in which there are lines that one can draw between all of these very disparate relationships? that there's simultaneity, the fact that they're taking place all right now. What way might we think that in some ways they affect each other, affect and are affected by each other? What are those kinds of lines of connection? I mean, it's impossible to think of a kind of method that would empirically prove particular kinds of notions of causation, that would really prove that somehow this is a kind of network of intersections. But in some ways, if one thinks about, all that transpires in urban life, it is not just the discernible, it is not just the recognizable, it's not just the way in which we order things. I mean, we depend, for example, on the technical apparatuses of infrastructure as a way to, in some ways, think through those kinds of connections. This is the road that goes from here to there. These are the kinds of pipes and the lines and the broadband. These are all of the kinds of technical affordances of the city that facilitate a sense of connectivity through infrastructure, through these kinds of ways of structuring the material flows that we need in order to materially survive within urban conditions. Infrastructure at times provides the map. But are there other forms of the infrastructural, of the infrapolitical, ways that might that in some ways provide a kind of map, a kind of sensibility through which in some ways people are able to navigate and think through and sense their lives in ways which are not in some sense subject to particular kinds of valuation, particular kinds of categorization. So this is what I mean, that in some way that the technical dimensions of relationalities of urbanization come from all over the place, that they work in different degrees and proportions and manifestations that come to be associated with it, but don't intrinsically belong to it. And then I have some materials here about, in some sense, how this notion of extensions perhaps operates in what are, in some ways, places within the city that are known as the extensions, the extensions of the city, the far suburbs, the periphery, the hinterlands. But before I do this, in some sense, I would be interested in hearing from you, who you are, what you're doing, what kinds of things are important to you, get a sense of what you're thinking. So I would prefer to maybe stop now and get a sense for you to take some time to say something about these things. So who would like to start?